Three nations have officially walked away from ECOWAS, rejecting its influence and forging their path. For now, ECOWAS has allowed them to continue visa-free travel. But for how long? Will ECOWAS turn a blind eye? Or will it decide to teach them a lesson by revoking this privilege and isolating them completely? Sensing the uncertainty, the Alliance of Sahel States AES has taken matters into its own hands, launching its passport, a move that signals defiance and independence. But what does this mean for the newly free nations? How has ECOWAS responded to this bold act? Here, we would like to take a moment and thank you for supporting us and being a valued part of our strong community. And if you are not yet a member, we encourage you to join us and help build an even stronger community together. Let's get started. The decision to launch the AES passport was not just an administrative move, it was a strategic necessity. While ECOWAS has currently allowed citizens of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger to continue using free visa travel, there is no guarantee this will remain the case. The three nations understand that ECOWAS still holds power over regional mobility, and at any moment, the organization could revoke this privilege as a means of punishment or control. By creating its passport, the Alliance of Sahel States AES is ensuring that it no longer depends on ECOWAS policies to determine the movement of its people. This is not just about travel, it is about sovereignty. ECOWAS, despite its current leniency, still has the authority to suspend the visa-free status of these nations, effectively isolating them and making it harder for their citizens to conduct business, seek employment, or even visit neighboring countries. This kind of political maneuvering has been used in global diplomacy before, where regional bodies punish breakaway nations by restricting their ability to move freely. The AES bloc is refusing to leave that possibility in ECOWAS's hands. The AES passport is a preemptive strike against any attempt by ECOWAS to tighten its grip. If ECOWAS were to suddenly revoke visa-free travel, citizens of these three nations could immediately shift to using their AES passport, allowing them to continue moving freely within the newly formed bloc without needing ECOWAS recognition. Instead of scrambling for solutions if ECOWAS decided to isolate them, AES is acting ahead of time to ensure its people do not suffer. The passport is also a tool of legitimacy. The more countries recognize it, the weaker ECOWAS' hold becomes over regional governance. If other African nations begin accepting the AES passport as valid for travel, ECOWAS will lose its monopoly over regional integration and will be forced to rethink its strategy. The passport is not just a travel document, it is a declaration that AES intends to operate as an independent political and economic force, whether ECOWAS acknowledges it or not. Launching the AES passport is also a direct challenge to ECOWAS authority. By establishing their system of movement, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are essentially saying, "We do not need your approval to exist as a functional bloc." This is the kind of defiance that could inspire other ECOWAS nations to consider leaving, especially those who feel similarly dissatisfied with the organization's governance. If the AES passport succeeds, it will prove that nations can leave ECOWAS and still function without its infrastructure. It would be the first real alternative model for regional governance in West Africa, and if more countries start recognizing it, ECOWAS' control over regional politics could begin to crumble. Beyond the logistics of travel, the AES passport is a symbol of independence. It tells the world that Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are not merely defying ECOWAS, but actively building a new system, one that does not rely on France, the West, or even traditional African institutions. It is a move that sends shockwaves not only through West Africa, but through global diplomatic circles. The AES nations understand that sovereignty is not just about breaking away. It is about proving they can build something new, functional, and independent. The passport is one of the first steps in that direction. And how is ECOWAS reacting to this? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. ECOWAS is deeply unsettled by the departure of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. These three countries were not just ordinary members. They played crucial roles in regional security, economic cooperation, and trade. Their exit represents a major crisis for ECOWAS, and the organization is struggling to figure out how to respond. On the surface, ECOWAS is downplaying the situation, continuing to recognize the old passports of these nations and allowing their citizens to travel visa-free within the bloc. However, this should not be mistaken for goodwill. The reality is that ECOWAS is buying time while it decides how to handle the crisis. There is a very real possibility that ECOWAS will soon take stronger action, either to pressure the breakaway nations into returning or to make their exit as difficult as possible. From the moment Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger announced their withdrawal, ECOWAS has been caught in a state of panic and denial. Instead of immediately confronting the issue, it pretended that nothing had changed, refusing to acknowledge the seriousness of the situation. Internally, ECOWAS leaders know that if these countries succeed outside the bloc, it could encourage other nations to leave as well. Guinea, which has also had tensions with ECOWAS, is already reconsidering its position. Even countries that are still in the bloc, like Senegal and Ghana, are closely watching how the AES alliance develops. If AES proves that it can function without ECOWAS, it will completely undermine ECOWAS' authority over West Africa. ECOWAS' current strategy is to act as if the departure is temporary, as if Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger will eventually realize that leaving was a mistake and come back. But deep down, ECOWAS knows that if these nations can establish their trade agreements, form new military alliances, and solidify their political independence, there will be no going back. Right now, ECOWAS is facing a difficult choice. Does it punish Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger for leaving, or does it try to negotiate and bring them back? If ECOWAS decides to punish the breakaway nations, the most likely method will be through economic isolation. Right now, ECOWAS still allows citizens of these nations to move freely within the bloc. However, this could change. If ECOWAS decides to suspend this privilege, it would severely impact businesses, traders, and travelers who rely on regional movement. The ECOWAS banking system helps facilitate cross-border trade, money transfers, and financial stability. If ECOWAS cuts these nations off, it could make it harder for them to do business with neighboring countries. The biggest threat to ECOWAS is if other nations begin accepting the AES passport. If that happens, it means ECOWAS has lost its control over regional mobility. To prevent this, ECOWAS may pressure countries like Ghana, Côte d'Ivoire, and Senegal not to recognize the AES passport, making travel and trade more difficult for the breakaway nations. ECOWAS has been involved in various development projects, including roads, energy supply, and regional integration efforts. If these nations are cut off, they may lose access to critical development funding. If ECOWAS takes these steps, it would be a clear attempt to punish the breakaway nations and make them regret leaving. However, this approach also carries risks. If ECOWAS goes too far, it could push other frustrated members to consider leaving as well. The biggest fear for ECOWAS is that this breakaway movement will spread. If Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger prove that they can survive and even thrive outside of ECOWAS, then what is stopping Guinea, Chad, or even other nations from doing the same? This is why ECOWAS cannot afford to let them succeed too easily. The bloc has to make its departure look painful, otherwise it loses its power. At the same time, ECOWAS is in a difficult position. If it punishes these countries too harshly, it risks looking like a colonial enforcer, acting on behalf of France and the West rather than its people. If it does nothing, it risks losing credibility and influence over the region. Despite the growing tensions, ECOWAS has not completely shut the door on these nations returning. There have been reports that ECOWAS officials are exploring ways to open dialogue with the breakaway nations, hoping to negotiate a return under new conditions. However, the question is, do Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger even want to come back? From the moment they announced their withdrawal, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have remained firm in their stance. They have no intention of returning to ECOWAS unless the organization undergoes major structural reforms. They have not left because they wanted isolation, but because they saw no future for themselves under an institution that prioritizes external influence over African interests. For years, ECOWAS has positioned itself as the foundation of West African cooperation. But for these three nations, it has functioned as a gatekeeper rather than a protector. Every decision, from economic policies to political interventions, seemed to be made not with the well-being of its African members in mind, but with the interests of foreign nations, particularly France, the European Union, and the United States. If ECOWAS truly wants to win them back, it must prove that it can serve its member states fairly and without bias. The breakaway nations have been clear about their conditions for a possible return. One of the core grievances that led to the formation of the Alliance of Sahel States (AES) was the belief that ECOWAS was operating under the influence of Western nations, particularly France. For years, policies set by ECOWAS seemed to align more with the strategic goals of the West than with the needs of African people. Sanctions, economic regulations, and even military interventions have repeatedly appeared to serve foreign powers who still see West Africa as a resource hub rather than a region that should govern itself. In the eyes of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, this made ECOWAS an enforcer of neo-colonial interests rather than a true African union. If ECOWAS wants to bring these nations back, it must demonstrate that it can act independently, making decisions based on what benefits West Africans, not what benefits foreign stakeholders. This means cutting the economic and military strings that tie ECOWAS decisions to the demands of France and its allies. Without this fundamental change, there is little incentive for the breakaway nations to rejoin, and the sanctions imposed on Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger following their military-led transitions were one of the biggest reasons for their departure. Instead of trying to engage in dialogue and find African-led solutions, ECOWAS chose to punish them economically, blocking trade, freezing assets, and restricting access to regional banking. To the leaders of these nations, this response was not just hostile, it was hypocritical. They watched as ECOWAS took no significant action against countries like Côte d'Ivoire or Senegal, where governments aligned with Western interests, even when those governments faced internal crises. Yet, when Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger took steps towards self-governance that did not align with French or Western expectations, they were immediately sanctioned. For the AES bloc, these sanctions were clear proof that ECOWAS was not acting in the interest of its member states, but rather following instructions from external actors. If ECOWAS truly wants to regain the trust of these nations, it must end the practice of using economic sanctions as a political weapon. Instead, it should act as a mediator that helps nations resolve internal conflicts without external interference. Until ECOWAS can guarantee that it will never again punish nations for choosing their leaders or policies, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger will see no reason to return. Perhaps the most important demand from the AES nations is that ECOWAS must stop interfering in the internal politics of its members. They believe that ECOWAS has overstepped its boundaries by attempting to dictate what kind of government is acceptable and who should be in power. ECOWAS often claims to support democratic transitions, but its actions have shown inconsistency and bias. While it imposed harsh sanctions on Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger for military-led changes in government, it did not intervene when Western-backed leaders in other ECOWAS nations made undemocratic moves. This double standard has led the breakaway nations to conclude that ECOWAS does not genuinely support democracy, but rather supports governments that align with foreign economic and military interests. If ECOWAS truly wants them to consider returning, it must abandon its practice of political interference. Every nation within the bloc must have the freedom to choose its leadership and system of governance without fear of external punishment. Until ECOWAS acknowledges this, the AES nations have no incentive to return. And is ECOWAS willing to change? For ECOWAS to accept these demands, it would need to admit that its past actions were unjustified. It would have to acknowledge that it has prioritized foreign interests, used economic warfare against its members, and failed to respect national sovereignty. This is something that ECOWAS is unlikely to do. Admitting fault would weaken its credibility among its remaining members, who would then begin questioning the entire structure of the organization. It could also lead to internal divisions within ECOWAS, as some countries would likely support the proposed reforms, while others, especially those with strong ties to France, would resist them. Given these challenges, The chances of ECOWAS making the necessary changes to bring these nations back are extremely low. Even if ECOWAS were to somehow reform itself, there is another question to consider. Would Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger even want to return? Since leaving ECOWAS, they have begun building their regional alliance, one that does not operate under the shadow of foreign control. They are forming new trade partnerships with China, Russia, Algeria, and the Middle East, developing their military cooperation and crafting a political framework based on self-reliance. For the first time, these nations are not playing by someone else's rules. Would they want to give up their newfound independence just to return to an organization that once tried to crush them? Right now, the AES nations have no reason to go back, and every reason to keep moving forward. Unless ECOWAS undergoes a radical transformation, the likelihood of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger returning is close to zero. The relationship between these nations and ECOWAS has been damaged beyond repair, and every day that passes makes their independence from the bloc more permanent. Instead of looking back, these nations are forging a new path, one that could reshape the balance of power in West Africa. And as they continue to strengthen their alliances and solidify their new identity, it seems increasingly likely that their break from ECOWAS is not temporary, but permanent. Now the question is, can AES even survive? Will the three nations ever regret leaving ECOWAS? The launch of the AES passport and the rapid formation of new alliances prove one undeniable fact. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are not only surviving outside ECOWAS, but they may be better off without it. By creating their system of travel and mobility, they have taken a major step toward full regional independence, ensuring that their citizens and businesses are not at the mercy of ECOWAS policies. More importantly, by forging new trade and military partnerships with nations like China, Russia, and Algeria, they are building an alternative economic and security structure that is no longer reliant on Western-controlled institutions. Instead of depending on ECOWAS' restrictive trade policies and financial systems, they are crafting a more flexible, sovereign framework that allows them to set their terms in global markets. This shift is not just about independence, it is about power. For years, ECOWAS rules and sanctions have been used to control and discipline nations, keeping them aligned with external interests. But now, AES is proving that an African-led alternative is possible. Their vast gold, uranium, and oil reserves give them a strong economic foundation, while their strategic location ensures they remain geopolitically important to rising global powers. Instead of being trapped in a system where their natural wealth benefits others, they are now in a position to dictate their future. If ECOWAS once believed that these nations would struggle alone, AES is showing that they are not just surviving, they are thriving. Do you think the three nations would return? Or will other nations join them? Let us know in the comment section. Is AES going to be a success? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.